So I've been to 100 or so climate change talks in the last few years, and many of them started by showing this chart, the significant increase in atmospheric CO2. However, none said that at a global level, there's been a 99% correlation between human population and atmospheric carbon dioxide. That despite the complex science of climate change, despite the roles of consumption and technology in driving emissions, and despite significant regional variability in this trend, there's been a persistent and seemingly unbreakable correlation at the global level. It is debatable whether our small planet can provide decent living standards for 7.7 billion humans, but it is indisputable that our planet cannot provide for billions of humans while enabling other species to flourish. Today, I wanted to ensure that I discussed overpopulation first before discussing the food system in the rest of the lecture. Because until we take seriously the problem of uncontrolled human population growth, our efforts to address other environmental issues will, in the long term, be futile. What worries me a lot is the often made claim that population growth will flatten off by itself. The United Nations median birth rate scenario, which is the most widely used forecast of population, predicts a global population of 11 billion by 2100, and in 2100 the population is still growing at 10 million per year. However, just to get onto this trajectory will require hard work, significant financial resources, and political and individual willpower. We cannot just expect to fall onto this forecast. We must work to achieve it. What worries me the most, though, is the implicit acceptance of the United Nations median scenario and the 2100 population of 11 billion. Given that we are failing on virtually every sustainability issue today with a population 2/3 that size, it is near impossible to foresee a healthy planet if we don't, in fact, get onto a lower trajectory. One, for example, where in 2100 the population is at least no greater than it is today. Perhaps a reason why population is almost never discussed is because addressing it will involve hard ethical decisions on which nobody has a monopoly, but everybody has a collective responsibility. However, there is in fact a tried and tested approach to ethically address population issues. It involves getting the poorest in society out of poverty, providing education equally to males and females, and making contraception easily available all over the globe. So given this approach exists and works, perhaps another reason for failing to address population, particularly by politicians, is because a country's power is invariably tied to the size of its young working population. Countries like China and India have become superpowers because of their huge and growing populations. On the other hand, countries like Japan and Hungary are actively seeking to boost birth rates. To shift onto a sustainable trajectory, the industrialized and newly industrialized nations of the world in particular must show that there is an alternative model for development that delivers a strong economy and allows humans to live affluently while actually reducing our burden on the planet. This is a model that doesn't see human beings as an anonymous pool of labor, working to extract as much from the planet as possible. Rather, it is one that sees humans as individuals, where small families and small national populations are the norm, and where we use our intelligence to both thrive and constantly reduce our environmental impact on the Earth. We must discuss population. We must discuss environmental issues, and we must jointly create a vision for a sustainable future with a smaller global population. Without discussion, we will never plan for this future, and we will certainly never achieve it. Today, using the latest environmental science, I will set out an ambitious plan for tackling the environmental impacts of a sector that has driven the degradation of our planet on more than any other. I will focus on the consumption and production aspects of the sustainability equation, and not on human population. This is because in agriculture, there is still a lot we don't know, and because with 7.7 billion people on Earth already, addressing population growth alone will not be sufficient. But today I have tried to break the trend of avoiding discussions on population, and I hope that more lectures will do the same. Before presenting the plan for the food system, I need to reveal all the major environmental issues associated with producing food. Because although this is a climate change lecture, climate change is only one of the environmental problems caused by agriculture, and it's only one of our environmental problems. So today I'm going to start at the agricultural frontier in Mato Grosso state. In the foreground is a beef farm, in the background is the Amazon rainforest. And if you look at this farm from satellite imagery, what you see is it's just one of millions of farms in Brazil carved out of what was pristine rainforest only 10, 20, or 50 years ago. And this swathe of farmland that's just beginning to emerge on the screen now spans much of the south of the continent, stretching right round here. Much of this deforestation has been for beef, for the local South American market, and for soy to feed pigs, especially in Asia. What I will show later is that both the land use of animal products and the contribution of animal proteins to deforestation is far greater than vegetable proteins. To put this another way, the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest has largely taken place because many humans prefer the taste of animal proteins to vegetable proteins. And this is a global story. In this map, black areas are urban, representing about 1 to 2% of the world's land area. Yellow areas are croplands. Red areas are grazing lands. In total, agriculture occupies over half the world's land. But despite this vast area, agriculture is still expanding in many regions. This chart is recent data showing the annual forest loss to agriculture each year derived from satellite data. Since 2000, we've lost an area of tropical forest to agriculture the size of the UK, Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland combined. As well as releasing carbon into the atmosphere, this has serious consequences for wild animals. The sociable lapwing, leopard, marbled polecat, and Egyptian vulture are 4 species threatened by the expansion of agriculture. But they are just 4 of the 13,000 known species that are threatened with extinction because of agriculture. And in the last few years, climate change has moved from forecasts to lived reality. Last year, winter temperatures in the Arctic were about 5 degrees Celsius warmer than usual. And our research found that food was responsible for 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If you include biofuels, textile production, and other non-food agriculture, that takes it to about 31% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But agricultural land can actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, whether this is through better management of the land or through trees growing on abandoned farmland. I will come back to this point later, because agriculture will probably be crucial for keeping the global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees. We also estimated that food production causes a third of acid rain, and the same agricultural compounds that cause acid rain, ammonia and nitrous oxide, also damage human health. In the Mississippi Basin, fertilizer and animal manure have run off into the sea, causing algae to bloom, which use up much of the oxygen. This process is called eutrophication. There is an area in the Gulf of Mexico, almost the size of Belgium, that doesn't have enough oxygen for complex life like fish, and food production causes about 80% of eutrophication. Agricultural water withdrawals from rivers, lakes, and groundwater, primarily for irrigation, represents 70% of the world's freshwater withdrawals. Or if you weight those withdrawals by local water scarcity, agriculture represents about 90% of scarcity-weighted water use. Agriculture is therefore a sector that drives almost all of our major environmental issues. And the challenges of addressing these issues will grow every year. we need to produce more food in the next 50 years than we produced in the last 500. Specifically, by 2050, we're forecast to be consuming 60% more meat and dairy, a staggering 1.2 trillion litres of dairy milk and 500 billion kilograms of meat per year. However, to address these issues, we need to realize that the mitigation challenge in agriculture is unlike any other sector of the economy. There are 570 million farms in almost every climate and soil. There are 2 million recorded crop varieties. Compare that to cars, where there are about 430 brands, 14 companies own 54 of the largest brands. So this is a fundamentally different issue, a fundamentally different sector to tackle the environmental issues of. So before moving on to solutions, I'll just summarize what I've said so far. Firstly, agriculture sits at the heart of almost all of our environmental problems. Secondly, achieving sustainability is going to become harder with growing demand. And thirdly, solutions must be effective over millions of diverse producers. So that's the end of the bad stuff. Now we're going to start talking about solutions. So to try and understand solutions that are effective under this diversity, we began a 5-year project that consolidated published data from studies where researchers have basically visited or surveyed farms all around the world and conducted life cycle assessments to estimate environmental impacts. A life cycle assessment effectively takes data on the inputs and outputs of farmers, such as fertilizer and crop yield, and then combines lots of different small-scale, farm-scale emissions models and resource use models to calculate overall environmental impacts. And so in our paper, we reported environmental impacts on 5 important environmental indicators: amount of land used to produce food, the amount of irrigation water used to produce food, greenhouse gas emissions, acid rain, and eutrophication caused by each food. And the farms in our database covered 40 major food products that represent about 90% of our protein and calorie intake, as well as some other foods in there that were a bit smaller and additional. So in total, our database covered 750 published studies in 120 countries, of which about 40% of those studies were in South America, Africa, and less industrialized Asian countries. So what we did is checked how representative this sample of farmers was by weighting each study by how representative it was. For example, an organic wheat producer might represent 1% of wheat production in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom might represent 2% of global wheat production, giving that study a weight of 0.02%. So we then multiplied the impact of each food by global consumption of that food. What we found is that the average 10th percentile and 90th percentile crop yields from our sample of farms reconciled to within plus or minus 10% of yields reported by the Food and Agriculture Organization. We also found our global estimates, when we scale up by global consumption our data, our global estimates of arable land use, agricultural methane, and irrigation water use reconciled to numbers that we know from other sources, such as system models or census data. So a relatively kind of random sample of farms is actually we've weighted it and treated it in such a way that it's actually representative of global consumption. And we calculated impacts for the full food supply chain. Started with the burning and clearing of forests and conversion of peat soils to farmland and the emissions that causes. We looked at the fertilizer and pesticide manufacture, fertilizer and pesticide transport to farm, irrigation water use, energy use on farm, losses of nitrogen and phosphorus to the water and the air. We looked at emissions from aquaculture, including, we built one of the first models that estimates how much methane is created from fish excreta and unconsumed feed that goes to the bottom of fish ponds in unaerated fish ponds. Surprisingly, farmed fish can create more methane than cows. We also assessed the emissions from farmed animal production. We looked at the impacts and energy use of food processing. We looked at packaging, including end-of-package disposal. We looked at food retail, and then we looked at all the food transport between each stage of the supply chain. Retail is where we finished our study because that's the point of consumer choice. Inputs is where we started our study because that's the point of where producers are making choices. So in sum, this is probably, to my knowledge, the most comprehensive data set on the environmental impacts of food built so far. But our data set relies on the work of hundreds of researchers who've gone out and collected all this data, just to be clear. Yeah. First observations. Impacts between producers of the same product can be extremely different. And we see this both at the local and global levels. So on this chart, the second bar shows the range of environmental impacts from data on about 8,000 rice farms. The bottom of that bar represents producers with 10th percentile greenhouse gas emissions or relatively low emissions. The top of the bar represents, or the right side of the bar represents producers with 90th percentile impacts or high impacts. And for rice, there's a 6 times or 500% difference between low and high emissions rice producers. Put simply, two products that look exactly the same in the shops can have dramatically different impacts on the environment. And today we have no way of telling them apart. We can plot these charts. We can plot these same charts for all sorts of different indicators. And for grains, we found that there were differences of at least 3 times between 10th and 90th percentile emissions and water use, even in similar growing regions such as the Yangtze River Basin, the United States Corn Belt, and the Australian Wheat Belt. So this variability, even within regions, suggests very significant potential to enhance productivity and reduce impacts in the food sector. And that's really important. Just as a side note, I'm not showing water use here. You can get that in the paper. The water use shows a huge variability between farmers, primarily simply if you irrigate or not. And the bars just get very, very large. And what that says is that the way to tackle water use in agriculture is really by changing practices. And really the way to tackle irrigation water use is to improve the yield and growth of actually rain-fed crops. That's just an aside. So I'll just show those indicators, but there's more in the paper. So I'm showing some more results for different products. 1 pint of beer can create 3 times more emissions and use 9 times more land than another. Again, it's impossible to know which one is which when you're in the pub or whatever. A bar of chocolate could create 7 kilograms of CO2 emissions. Another bar of which is about the same as driving 30 miles in a petrol car, typical petrol car. So that's pretty incredible compared to 0 emissions. Because if the cocoa trees are growing and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they can effectively net off all the other emissions that chocolate's causing. So huge variability. However, a particularly striking and important finding from our study, which has been found in previous work as well, was that these distributions are very skewed. Specifically, we found that 25% of producers create 55% of food's environmental impacts. So our question was, how can we access this mitigation potential and target the small number of producers that create most harm? So our research looked at lots of different mitigation ideas for different actors in the whole food supply chain. And we basically provided the evidence for this framework. So just to kind of briefly summarize what this is before going into more detail, we suggest that farmers should monitor their own environmental impacts using new digital tools. We suggest that, we find evidence that policymakers should incentivize actual environmental impacts rather than incentivizing farmers to change their practices. And we also provide evidence that these impacts should be communicated up the supply chain and through to consumers. And this kind of approach is actually pretty similar to what a lot of existing efforts are doing. are moving towards anyway. For example, the European Union's Product Environmental Footprint Programme. But what we've done is brought all these different approaches together and crucially provided the evidence that this is the right approach, or at least a good amount of evidence that this is the right approach. So to start with, I'll provide evidence for why farmers should monitor their own environmental impacts on multiple indicators. Previous research has said that we can use simple, easy-to-measure proxies to manage environmental impacts. For example, multiple studies have claimed that we can use nitrogen use efficiency to manage nutrient pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And nitrogen use efficiency is just defined as how much nitrogen is applied to the field divided by crop yield. So these graphs show that globally there is a very low correlation between nitrogen use efficiency, kilograms of nitrogen per kilogram of yield, and greenhouse gas emissions. There's also a low correlation between crop yield and emissions, despite many studies proposing we use crop yield as a proxy for environmental outcomes. And we found these same weak correlations even when we looked and zoomed into this data for specific regions. So this is global. When we zoomed in, we found similar results. In total, we looked at 48 proxy impact combinations, and I'm just showing a few of them in blue on the right of this slide. And we found consistently low correlations. One example, just how this is a real-world thing. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations recommends increasing milk yield per cow to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the dairy sector, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk. When we used our data on a wider set of producers in different geographies, we found quite weak support for the FAO's strategy. Previous studies have also suggested that we might be able to use one indicator to basically predict another. So, for example, we might use eutrophication to predict greenhouse gas emissions. And we found that different environmental indicators also correlate quite weakly. Specifically, correlations which were measured as R squared with a nonlinear fit were between 0 and 30%. So that's pretty low. You couldn't use these techniques for decision making. So these results suggest that we should monitor actual environmental impacts, not proxies, and that we should measure multiple impacts. So the first step is to enable producers to monitor their own impacts. So while the data to do this is not complicated, we can't derive the kind of data required to do a life cycle assessment from satellite data or from agricultural censuses. We need data from farmers themselves. And in fact, we have these tools already. This is an example called Field to Market, which is used to track the environmental impacts over time on 2 million acres of farmland in the United States. And these tools take basic farm information such as soil properties or fertilization schedules, and they then use this information to estimate environmental impacts, basically a sufficient accuracy for on-farm decision making. And interestingly, these monitoring tools, when you get farmers using them, often reveal pretty simple ways to reduce emissions. And one example is Costco's organic egg producers, just by using a UK-based tool called the Cool Farm tool, found ways to reduce their emissions by 13% just by understanding what they are and just finding really easy ways to address them. So I'll now look at the evidence for the next part. So as well as these low correlations, we found things went a bit further. And we also found that in many cases, impacts actually trade off. So that by reducing one indicator might actually increase another. And one way to show this is to look at what happens when farmers change their practices. For example, if a farmer changes from conventional production to organic farming, or to alternatively compare farms with slightly different practices in a similar location. And to read these graphs, imagine that at the beginning, the farm is in the origin or the center of the graph, and following a change in practice, we basically measure their change on land use. So a reduction in land use would go to the left, an increase in land use would go to the right, an increase in emissions would go up, a decrease in emissions would go down. And those bars are basically just summarizing that information. So again, lots of variability. Some farmers reduced their impacts a lot following a change in practice, some very little. But some practices fall in the top left and bottom right sections, i.e. where you reduce one impact at the cost of another, so the other one goes up. Very few fall on this kind of straight line in the bottom left corner, where basically everything's improving. And in our paper, we looked at these plots for different indicators, and we also discussed other ways that you get trade-offs in agriculture, for example, by increasing yields over a certain threshold. So in the face of trade-offs, we need to tell producers what they should focus on by setting targets on multiple indicators. So, for example, a producer in California might have targets that are more focused on water use, targets for a producer in the Mississippi Basin, where nitrogen overuse is a problem, would have targets focused on eutrophication. So I'll now look at the evidence why we should let producers meet these targets, however is most viable for them. So these graphs show the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions on a farm. For example, this wheat farmer in Australia on the top left, half of their greenhouse gas emissions in that kind of light brown color are created when fertilizer is broken down by bacteria in the soil and then enters the atmosphere instead of being used as a plant. So that's the nitrous oxide emissions from synthetic fertilizer. However, what we found is that sources of emissions vary considerably between different producers. For example, while nitrous oxide emissions are a major source for this Australian wheat farmer, for a third of global crop calorie production, nitrous oxide emissions represent less than 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. And in our study, we reported that a lot of this variability is driven by geographic factors such as soil and climate, but also other factors such as existing farming practices. And what this suggests is that strategies to reduce emissions need to be highly differentiated across producers, that different producers need different ways to reduce their impacts, that as we saw on the previous slide, adopting practices like organic farming or conservation tillage will work for some producers, but it's not going to work for others. So just to restate this point, we should consider practice changes such as conventional tillage or organic farming not as environmental solutions in themselves, but as options that producers choose from to meet an environmental target. And in China, a massive program actually trialed a flexible mitigation approach with a very Chinese scale, 21 million smallholder farmers. So farmers who monitored and flexibly addressed their impacts reported 12% yield increases and 20% cuts in emissions compared to farmers that just adopted out-of-the-book practices. So just one important thing to point out, though, is if we use such a flexible mitigation approach, we must put in place more stringent sustainability standards than already exist, particularly for issues that are hard to quantify and track, such as pesticide use, and on issues that are hard to manage at the farm level, such as deforestation. So if we're allowing farmers to basically do what they want within certain parameters of certain indicators, we need to be pretty clear that there are some things that are monitored extremely carefully. So the evidence for why we should communicate impacts up the supply chain is provided in our paper, but now I'm going to focus on why we should communicate impacts to consumers. Today, meat, aquaculture, eggs and dairy use 83% of the world's farmland and contribute nearly 60% of food's different emissions, despite providing just 37% of our protein and 18% of our calories. And we wanted to understand this question: is it possible to produce animal products more sustainably and redress this vast imbalance? But first, just to understand what 83% of the world's farmland actually is, This slide shows that we farm an area the size of Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay just to produce dairy products. This much land is used to produce beef. An area the size of the UK is in fact required to produce feed for farmed fish. And something we didn't actually look at in our study is extensive rangelands, and they occupy kind of that much area. So back to the question on whether we can produce animal products more sustainably. Again, we can plot these same graphs showing the range of environmental impacts for different animal products and different vegetable proteins for the same amount for 100 grams of delivering 100 grams of protein or for delivering 1 litre of protein-corrected milk. So it's milk, it's basically whole milk, 3.3% protein, 4% fat. And again, we find very significant variability. High-impact beef is creating 1,000% more emissions than low-impact beef and using 5,000% more land than low-impact beef for the same amount of protein. Staggering, huge variability, and we would never know this in the shops. However, even the lowest impact beef per 100 grams of protein is responsible for 6 times more greenhouse gas emissions and 36 times more land than beans and pulses. So, so just some more little interesting bits of this. So for nuts, consumption is growing very rapidly. At the moment, nut production is basically doubling every 15 years. And this is kind of having an interesting consequence because nuts are often planted on old croplands. And the net effect of this is that as nut trees are growing, they're actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at the moment today. It's obviously temporary, and you can see that with nuts. You get a lot of negative emission nuts out there. So the same thing can obviously happen if you manage grazing lands better. So if you manage grazing lands through fertilization, through liming, they can actually the soil carbon and the below ground biomass can increase, and that can take carbon dioxide out the atmosphere. However, for grazing animals, the benefit we found is no more than 20% of their greenhouse gas emissions. But for me, one of our most important findings was that across all protein-rich products and milks, even the lowest impact animal products create more emissions and typically use more land than vegetable products for the same amount of protein. So that says today that eating plant-based proteins and milks delivers greater environmental benefits than trying to purchase sustainable meat and dairy. And in our paper, we also provided the evidence for why we think this trend is going to hold into the future unless the farming system looks effectively nothing like it does today. So to understand the environmental benefits of not eating animal products, we looked at a scenario of a worldwide shift to a plant-based diet. So I'm just going to start with eutrophication. And the left bar shows effectively total global eutrophication across all sectors of the economy. So this is sewage, this is industrial caused eutrophication. So it's just under 90 million tons of phosphorus equivalents. And diet change reduces eutrophication by 40%. There's no other change in your consumption that could deliver such a big reduction. And on the previous slide, we showed that for eutrophication, they're probably not changes that producers can deliver either that would achieve such a big reduction. So global land use would be reduced by 3.1 billion hectares. So that's an area the size of the entire African continent. So on map projections, for historical reasons, Africa looks very small. It's in fact an absolutely massive continent. And so it's a 75% reduction in agricultural land use. And that actually includes a 20% reduction in arable land use, or prime cropland. So despite the fact that we're eating more soy, we're eating more nuts, we're still actually using less cropland. But before moving on, I just want to put this land use reduction in context for you. in context for you as individuals. And so just to start with, if you take all the land on Earth and divide it by the global population, we have about 17,000 meters squared of land per person. That's about how much is on Earth. So that's roughly the size of 3 football pitches. The Earth is actually pretty small. It's actually pretty parochial, small place. So today the current diet uses about 6,200 meters, and that should be to scale. Or 12,000 meters squared if you're a typical American. And no animal product diet uses just a fraction of that, and it basically frees up an area of land the size of roughly a football pitch. So I was looking at trying to work out how many football pitches. It turns out every football pitch actually has a different measurement. So, so when people compare things to football pitches, I think this is a Wembley football pitch. So I'm going to just put something up that probably not a lot of people are going to agree with, and it's just more for illustration. But if you look at global distributions of individual animals, not of species, you can have a look at where they're distributed on of their historic range and where they would have been on farmland today. You can broadly estimate that amount of land. So these aren't published numbers; they're based on other people's research. That's enough land for about 5 birds, 15 mammals, 20 reptiles, 100 amphibians, globally, on a global average piece of what was farmland. But what we are a lot more certain about in terms of the numbers is that this is enough land to store 150 tons of carbon dioxide in plants and soil, and reaccumulating soil carbon. So again, on the left, we can plot greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy. So this is everything. This is cars, planes, this is industry, this is household energy use, and agriculture. And what you find is that diet change reduces those emissions by 28%. So about half of that is avoided methane and nitrous oxide and other emissions that the food sector creates annually. And the other half is this green area, the potential of land to store carbon. And just to set these results in context, these are the largest potentials that anyone has actually reported for diet change, what I've got up here now. And why is this? It's because we look at the entire food supply chain, and crucially because now, recently, we include some revised numbers for the potential of carbon storage on the land no longer required to produce food. So this is the biggest number you will see on the greenhouse gas emission reduction for diet change at a global level. We can also have a look at these for the UK and the United States. And for the USA, it's a reduction of about 5 tons of CO2 equivalents a year. But if you actually look, the scale is different. So Americans are emitting about 20 tons of CO2 per year. There's also this bigger reduction. It's a 5-ton reduction because Americans also eat 3 times more meat than the global average. So I'm picking on Americans here, if you're American. But it's typical. Is it kind of where we may be going in the future? That's why I chose America. So it's 24% reduction. For the UK, it's a 34% reduction, or a reduction of about 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So consider, for example, that a big way to reduce your emissions is to buy an electric car or stop driving. That would save a UK consumer about 2 tons of CO2 per year. Consider that this 3 tons per year is about the same as 11 return flights from London to Rome. So just to be clear, 1 flight to Australia basically blows the budgets blows the savings from diet change. So, but what is clear is that the climate benefits of changing your diet are far greater than cutting down on your flights or buying an electric car. And what's more, for a typical average consumer, diet change isn't just the single biggest way to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, it's the single biggest way to reduce your land use, your impact on biodiversity, the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution caused by your food, the acid rain, the water use, and probably, although we didn't specifically measure it, the pesticide and antibiotic use that is being caused by the food system. Put simply, avoiding meat and dairy products is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on the planet. And by me making these comparisons, I do not mean to say that we shouldn't do other things. We must do everything that is required and that we need to do to deliver a sustainable future. But it's important also to know what matters most. And it's also, just with these numbers, it's also important to say that if instead of letting all this land just go back to nature, this farmland go back to nature, as we're assuming in these green boxes, if we instead use that land for something like biofuel production, so we chose how we use this land, it doesn't all have to go back to nature, these carbon storage numbers get a lot larger. And diet change basically frees up land that we need to deliver the ambitious negative emissions in the IPCC's recent 1.5 degrees report. So we can deploy technologies like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So we also looked at a second scenario. Given that I said earlier, a small number of producers create the majority of food's impact, what if we could use this skew to increase the power of consumer choices? Specifically, we considered a scenario where consumers reduce their consumption of animal products by 50% by avoiding producers with above average greenhouse gas emissions. That delivers about 70% of the climate benefits of the vegan diet, and it delivers a very similar number on the other environmental indicators. So for more discretionary products, some may not consider these discretionary, but for particularly oils and sugars, which we typically do actually consume too much of anyway, reducing our consumption of these products by just 20% reduces the environmental impacts of these products by 45% if we reduce consumption from that highest 20% impact producers. So there are clear strategies and synergies with health here, so clear environmental and health synergies. However, and this is crucial, to access these scenarios, consumers need to know the environmental impacts of actual producers, not just food products. So the next step to get consumers driving this crucial change in mitigation is to communicate environmental impacts up the supply chain and through to consumers. And with information about the environmental impacts of actual producers, we could also be could also create much more effective taxes and subsidies. And today, there are proposals for a meat tax. I think this is probably a good solution in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's a bad solution. Because, as we showed earlier, there's such huge variation in the environmental impacts of meat. A flat tax is basically going to penalize all producers equally, and it's going to fail to encourage practice change. A variable tax linked to actual environmental outcomes would be far more effective at driving change and accessing all that producer mitigation. So we then ask the question, if you look at this framework, what is the small change that we could make to basically trigger this whole framework and make it come into play? And for me, it's mandatory environmental labels. If each food product had to display its environmental impact on the front of its packaging, farmers would need to monitor their impacts on farm. This would encourage better decision-making and enable that flexible mitigation approaches that I was talking about earlier. Impacts would be communicated up the supply chain, allowing better sourcing by retailers and food processors. Information would also be available to producers further back in the supply chain, such as fertilizer producers and crop breeders, enabling, providing this information, driving better decision-making. Policymakers would also have information to act on that they simply do not have today. If you go to a farm, we simply do not know the environmental impacts. And with labels, consumers would be constantly exposed to the facts, the sustainability facts, every time they're in the shops, increasing awareness about the impacts of the food sector. And that information on the labels would enable more sustainable eating, where the effects of small consumer changes are amplified into much more significant benefits for the environment, as I showed in those previous slides. And these were just some mock labels I made for an article in The Guardian recently. In that article, I wrote about the fact that we also know labels work because we've tried them in lots of other sectors. And one example I talked about was the effect of labeling appliances, household appliances, with their energy efficiency. And initially, if you look at the fridge and freezer market, 75% of fridges and freezers were ranked G to D, so that was the lowest, basically the lowest ranking when the program started in the early 90s. Today, 98% are classed A++ and A++. And when the scheme started, you didn't even have A+, or A, to basically keep adding a plus after the A to make up for this progress. And worldwide, what you can also do is look at countries which haven't implemented labeling and countries that have. And what you find is that those that have, the energy efficiency of appliances increased 3 times faster than those that didn't. So it works. You can look at double glazing sector in the UK as well as a really good example of where labeling drove a massive improvement in efficiency. And introducing an equivalent system for food would, based on the evidence I've shown today, have just as great an impact, but in a sector we need it in the most. So just to summarize what I've said in the last little bit, there's a very significant potential to reduce food's environmental impacts, but mitigation requires a much more sophisticated approach than we're deploying today, and we must engage the full food supply chain. Mandatory environmental labels on food are the most promising way, in my opinion, to deliver this and shift the entire food system towards sustainability. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joseph. Come and have a seat here. We'll have a discussion.
Okay.
There's some water here. Would you like it?
Thanks.
Wow, so who paid for your study?
It was actually unfunded, yeah.
It was unfunded?
Yeah.
And
So I took some time off work worked in London. I took some time off work just to start what was supposed to be a 1-year project, actually. And then it kind of bloomed, and then Thomas, who's the co-author on the paper, got involved. And so that's basically where it came from, an underestimation of the time something would take.
And how many people were involved in collecting all that data?
Oh, well, the data that's behind this paper has been collected by thousands of researchers all around the world, and specifically there were, I think, 139 researchers who actually answered my emails asking them for more information about how they conducted their assessments. 139 people actually provided additional data to this study. So while there are 2 authors on this paper, it is the work of thousands of researchers who've gone onto farms and collected all this data.
And so how much travelling around did you have to do? Or was the data all collected by people?
It's desk-based, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's desk-based.
It's amazing. And
but Thomas, my co-author, is working the mitigation approach, and a lot of the ideas are also, they're not new in the sense. What we've specifically done is taken existing ideas out there, kind of bring them all together, and actually just provide evidence from them from this sample of farms. So it's not, so.
Fantastic.
Just to be clear. Yeah.
Now we've got plenty of time for questions, which is great, and we've got this talk has been live streamed, and we've seen that there's lots of people watching.
Right.
And if anyone who has been watching the live stream wants to feed in questions, we've got people monitoring the Facebook feed and the Twitter feed, the hashtag #CCLS2019. Do send in questions, and our team of people will be writing them down. This talk is going to be available to watch again. If you go to the cclsclimateseries.com webpage, you'll be able to watch it again. You'll be able to watch it and see what you thought. It's excellent. It's this numeracy is so important.
Yeah.
Understanding the numbers.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's That's what this whole thing is about. It's about saying this is a sector that's at the moment really completely opaque. It's really difficult if you're a farmer to actually know what you should do on environmental issues. Even if you want to address them, it's really difficult to understand. It's difficult if you're a policymaker to know what's actually happening across the sector. It's difficult. It's just a sector. If you're a researcher, it's really hard to get information on it. So what labelling does and what this whole thing does is creates transparency. And transparency, without transparency and without information, we've got nothing to go about on. So yeah, that's exactly right. It's about information.
So we try for, after this talk, those of us who are here will go and have some refreshments. And we've got local vegan beer, which is great. And we've got local vegan wraps. But actually, I don't know what they would say if I asked them for the information that you think we should have. I suspect that the Milton breweries up the road wouldn't be able to give us the numbers that we'd need.
No, it wouldn't.
So where would they go to find out the information?
Well, so that's why it's about. So there are some companies that do actually know their impacts, and so there's Alpro. There's a lot of nut and plant milk producers are actually it's quite easy to quantify the impacts of a plant milk, and some of them are actually doing that. You can find the numbers. Some corn puts their greenhouse gas numbers on their website. In my opinion, that's not enough, and they should actually be thinking about all the impacts that agriculture causes.
Absolutely.
And they should have those impacts on their products specifically. But you're right, today you can't do that. It's about, if you require labels, if you make them mandatory, farmers have got to create the information. And those tools are readily available. The information is not difficult to collect. It's basically saying what's the trigger that we're going to basically make that whole thing.
It's interesting you're saying that the information flowing this way is kind of half the point. It's the request for information flowing that way.
Exactly, and it's also if you look at what's changed in like double glazing fridges, freezers, it's really been producers that have been responding, and labels. Maybe 20-30% of consumers care. Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe we've got a caring audience in here, but that's what you find in surveys. But what you're doing is leveraging the power of those 20-30% to just change their behaviour, and it's in the interest of the whole market to move in the same direction towards sustainability.
So we're going to go out for questions. Jamie and Sophie are with the microphone. So put your hand up, and then we'll make sure we're ready for the next. When you finish asking your question, do hand the microphone back.
Oh, yeah.
So first question.
Hello, thank you for that lecture. It blew my mind. I can see some issues, though. In this country, we've had a huge reduction in the number of farmers, and farmers have become big business. And having been in education where you have to collect numbers, there is a cost to collecting numbers. But there's two things. One is the cost of collecting numbers, and two, the huge farm lobby. They're very, very powerful, and they won't like it.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I think with that study on the study that was done in China that was published in Nature, I think it was published in Nature last year. What they showed is that you can actually, by encouraging farmers to actually quantify their impacts, so they're not doing it, you can also give farmers advantages, and they used that platform to help farmers increase their yield, and you saw really strong positive benefits on yield while cutting emissions. So if you can give farmers another reason to use this platform that isn't just about environment, to use these tools, whether it's productivity enhancements, access to markets, whether it's access to capital, whatever it is about making sure that you're really giving farmers value, because farmers as well know that their data has value. It's also about giving them market access and access to premium markets, access to, or just market access full stop. If you're the one maybe in 20 years that isn't measuring your impacts, that's a negative, that's the kind of stick, and the other stuff is the carrots.
Hi, thank you very much. So you started talking about population, but I think before talking about population, I'd like to talk about inequalities, justice, and fairness. So it's important to note that 50% of the global CO2 emissions are emitted by the top 10% of the most wealthy. And the other way around, the bottom 50% of the population emits only 10% of the emissions. And I want to speculate that it's the same for many other environmental impacts. So effectively, by saying that we want and that we have to limit the population growth, we're shifting the burden of the reduction of environmental impacts to the bottom 50%, which are now having the highest birth rates, whereas the historical contributions to environmental degradation are largely among the 10%, which includes all of us. So I would think very carefully before going into these neo-Malthusian views on environmentalism. And actually, for me, the solution is taking the top 10% of the population and making them, and asking us to live a normal, dignified life at the average of the world. And that will really cut down, and that will really not undermine our dignity in the planet. And connected to that, there's the issue of taxes. Who should we tax? And you raise the point of meat taxes. And we have to be also very careful to see where do we put the burden of solving the climate and the environmental crisis that we're in. And I think that flat taxes for consumer taxes that go to the consumer just harm the poor most, because they are the ones that continue consuming but have less to pay these taxes. So I think the taxes should be really put into the large-scale producers that most benefit from the system that is wrecking the planet.
I mean, there's obviously another side to inequality when it comes to environment, which is the better costs of climate change are ultimately going to be felt not by the rich but by the poor. So, there are also other aspects to inequality, which is in less industrialized countries around the world, millions of women who want access to contraception and millions of men who want access to contraception simply cannot access it. And that is a serious inequality issue. Millions of children who would like to go to school cannot. That, again, is a serious inequality issue. But interesting, those two inequality issues are the ones that if you solve them, you've also solved population growth. So I don't actually see addressing inequality and putting the burden necessarily on the poor as incompatible at all with achieving our environmental goals. I see it as almost incredibly aligned.
So we've got a question right in the middle here, so we need to get the microphone there. It's on.
Thank you very much for the very informative and inspiring talk. And I really like the idea of labeling, and I'd be very happy to see that in the market. However, I'd like to make a comment on that. If you want to compare it with the electronics market, there would be a big difference when electronics it's a rather relatively large investment for a long run, and also it has a benefit for the consumers to choose because they will reduce their electricity bills. However, when it comes to food, other than feel good, like having less, using the less impactful food, I don't really see much benefits that consumer will enjoy from choosing it. Other than so that I think there is a still certain percentage of people will just choose to enjoy for the pleasure of having some food other than the environmental impact. So that's one thing that I wanted to. I mean, I don't want to criticize,
No,
but
it's a really good point. In that article I published in The Guardian, op-ed, you can basically, all you can do is look at surveys of why consumers have or say they have made a decision on things like electrical goods to choose the lower energy ratings. And you're exactly right. Many do, but actually only about half, 50%, are choosing purely for financial reasons. 50% are in fact choosing for environmental reasons. So there are people out there that do actually care about environmental issues. I would count myself in that category. I would, particularly if there's a food that looked the same, cost the same, tasted the same, just had a different environmental impact. And we found that in our paper. We found there are two foods that look exactly the same, dramatically different environmental impacts. In that situation, I think it would be very sad, human failing if we didn't choose the lower impact food. And my sense is that consumers would. The difference is when it's going between products. And you're right, that is a lot harder to incentivize. And that's why I do think in the long term we do have to pair these labels with taxes. because, people are like, and meat consumption simply does have to come down. And maybe taxes will affect the poor disproportionately. But the fact is that meat consumption today is dramatically higher than it's ever been in the past. It's not a, it's just so much higher, and it's going to get so much higher. And is it acceptable, whether you're poor or rich, to be eating that much meat in the face of environmental degradation? I would say no.
So we've got a question up
Hi.
here.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. I was really interested by the question already a while ago of the impact on obviously, you talked about specifically the land usage, depending on the kind of diet or the kind of product that you consume. And this, maybe I'm wrong if I say that, but I assume this is relying on the intensive agriculture or farming systems, which is also, if you talk about agriculture, it's probably monoculture lands, which is definitely a very specific way of thinking about how you use a land. But how about maybe just what data do we have about different kind of practices? For instance, permaculture, which uses a completely different way of exploiting the system, and also how to sequestrate carbon much more efficiently than, because a monoculture land is really inefficient at this, and it also is a disaster in terms of, for all the worms that normally, the difference, for instance, I've heard like a number about, in a monoculture land you have 200 kilos of worms per hectare, whereas like on a normal land, a living land, you have like 1.5 tons or something completely enormous.
I'm going to take this isn't my idea. I'm going to someone called Elke Steffes from PBR. She thinks about it as this land saving that you generate with diet change, and this land that's spared. It's actually an option. You basically create an option space, and you've got an option space to do different things. One is obviously keep the same intensity and rewild, and let land go back to nature. Another option is extensify production. So you'd have more systems like organic, permaculture. And there's a paper, I think, in Nature Climate Change that looked at shifting to organic farming. Basic diet change does enable that. Another option, as I said before, is you could use that land for bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which is basically growing energy crops on farmland, which displaces fossil fuels, and then you store effectively the carbon. So it's really about, diet change frees up this space to make choices about what we're going to do, and it doesn't have to go the way that we just go super intensive and free up land. We could extensify, for example.
Thank you very much. I thought that was unbelievably inspiring, but incredibly ambitious. So I wondered if you'd had, what responses you'd had from policymakers or government decision makers. Because another way to go would be the voluntary scheme way, and I spent years building up fair trade, which actually our evidence absolutely is that the public are ready to make ethical choices. A section of the public are absolutely ready to do it. The trick is you have enough that then also shifts the companies to do it voluntarily. And I wondered if you talked to any companies about what their responses were. And especially because I know in the early days when people tried to do carbon footprint labelling, it wasn't very successful because people just found it too complicated. Now maybe the debate has shifted enough that we can address that now, but I wondered if you'd looked at that.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And I think for carbon footprint labelling, what you had was people were taking 3 weeks to do a carbon footprint of a product. It was costing 10 grand. You're like, now you can do it in one line of a spreadsheet. It's become that simple. The available data has really changed. You've got these tools, Cool Farm Tool, Field to Market. They're free to use. And behind Cool Farm Tool, Field to Market, you've got hundreds of big companies backing them. And I think specifically, mandatory is so important for a number of reasons, but one of them is to make sure that if people are going out and doing these labels, you don't just have someone putting any label they want calculated with their own methodology. Having consistency is incredibly important. So mandatory would basically say, this is how you've got to measure it, this is the kind of framework you've got to measure it in, and make sure that it's the same message and the same important environmental indicators that everyone's measuring in the same way. Specifically, if people approach me, some companies have approached me, and the EPA and someone from DEFRA approached me, but I haven't had anything specific enough. So it's only been
So that brings us to a couple of questions, one from Facebook and one from Twitter. Are there plans to lobby governments to add the labels? And what about the challenges on these labels of different people's level of literacy? And have you spoken to Theresa May and Michael Gove? What do they think of all of this?
I haven't, no.
What about lobbying governments to change the labelling systems?
Yeah, for me, I think there's still a few steps before lobbying, and I think to get labels on products, my approach would not actually, my suggested approach, and this was actually something that someone called Matthew Glover suggested, it's his idea, not mine, and he basically says that we should, and the example of double glazing is we got companies on board first, and there's a process where it got proven, it was working. So you've got a bunch of, what you need is a bunch of engaged, interested companies who want to do this first, and they are actually out there. Some have approached me, some have approached other people I know. Companies want to do this. If you get a body of companies putting their labels on their products, that will start the whole process. And even if you get 30% of the market where it's working, that's the time to lobby. When you've got them, they're working, you've shown this is the right way to go. I think lobbying has got to come a bit further down the line. I would still say that while I think there's been some big step forwards in the science, there's still actually some way to go with the science. For example, on our label, we had biodiversity. That's literally one of the hardest things to measure at the product level. It's incredibly difficult. So there's still science on all of these things. There's science on pesticide toxicity, which it's very difficult to know what the toxicities of the thousands of different pesticides.
So last year, for one of our CCLS talks, we had Lisa Walker, who was quite keen on the idea of blockchain as a means of communicating the information from one end of the supply chain to the other. Is that something that interests you, or is that a way to go, or is it?
I think any technology that would make this a reality is good. I think. Yeah, I think any technology that would enable this. Obviously, it's a very big data kind of approach, and you would need some way to store and centralize vast amounts of data. So,
right. So another question from the floor here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just one thing you mentioned, which I have heard before, that to reduce the problems with the cows was to increase the milk yield.
yeah.
Dairy cows are already pushed to their absolute limit. They're living a quarter of their natural life cycle, and to burden them with more production seems to me, well, inexcusable.
Yeah. So to be clear, we found evidence against that. So what?
Sorry,
So to be clear, what I was saying is that the FAO has in its strategy to drive up milk yield per cow in less industrialized countries. Well, we found that when we looked at our sample of lots of different producers in lots of different countries, there isn't actually a very strong link between environmental performance and milk yield per cow. So we can actually break that fact and break what's driving the FAO's determination to push. Well, we can at least challenge it, not break it.
Yeah. So it hopefully won't happen.
Yeah. So we didn't find evidence that would be a good strategy environmentally, but I fully recognise your animal welfare point. And the less animal products we're demanding, the less we have to push the system more. And that 60% increase in animal products over the next, between now and 2050, all of that effectively is coming from intensive farming. So
now we've got about another 17 minutes for questions. So at the Twitter and Facebook questions should be streaming in.
Thank you. Just wanting to come back to the question of how accessible this type of approach would be for, as you said, you have a lot of very small actors and so on, and obviously you are giving an advantage to very big ones because there is a transaction cost to all the measurements and so on, and to try to play with the system, because on carbon market and other things we have seen that if you try to do something for environmental reason, you will have people trying to cheat with the rules. and you need to build something which is robust against that. So if you have any view on that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. How do you basically stop producers from just saying whatever environment, just making up environmental impacts? And there are a few ways to do that. One is a big development that's come with the new Sentinel-2 satellites, and so they're very, very high resolution satellites from the EU. And the European Union has now said that we can actually monitor common agricultural policy returns with Sentinel-2 data. So that's a big step towards automating estimation of crop yields, what crop the farmer's growing, what the crop area is. So you've got that check. You've also got the fact that if you're getting subsidy returns, someone's going to come and inspect your farm at some point. And millions of farmers around the world, there's something like nearly $1 trillion a year of subsidies. So there's a lot, there are people who will go and inspect these farms anyway. So you've got the remote checks, you've got the on-farm checks. You've also got basic benchmarks that you can look at. If someone's come out with a wacky environmental impact, you know those graphs, if they come out above or below the 90th or below the 10th or whatever, we've got good data already. We know if someone's come up with something really off-piste.
So last year we had a talk about using satellite observations for remote data gathering.
Yeah.
Is that something that links in well with this?
Yeah, definitely it does. But I think one of the limitations with that data is you can't get enough data to do those environmental impact calculations. So you've got to get data from farmers themselves, and that data includes how much fertilizer they're applying, which you can't get from satellites, what they're, how they're managing their crop residues, how they're managing their soil, all that kind of stuff you really struggle to get. So there's some stuff that remote sensing can do, and I'd say that's what crop is being grown, what's the area of that crop, what's the yield, possibly, within some rough bounds. But so there is stuff we can do, and that's really helpful for checking the validity of returns. But there's also the key part of that whole thing is getting real farmer data.
And on the data question, a Facebook question has come in about, is there data on the environmental impact of lab-grown meat? And can it scale up usefully? And what about insect diets? You don't have to answer all these questions.
Stretching my knowledge. Lab-grown meat. Our colleague John Lynch has just published a paper on lab-grown meat, and I think he found that if you use, it's obviously more energy intensive. You've got to use a lot of energy. I think if the energy comes from renewable sources, it's fine. If it doesn't come from renewable sources, it's a problem. So that's all I can. Insects.
Question in the middle. No, we'll leave that for discussion over our.
Yeah, or maybe not.
Hi. So I've been interested in conservation for a while now and been vegan for many years. And every time I kind of talk to somebody about it, they always make jokes and have comments to say, and there's still a stigma attached towards it. And everyone will always still want to eat animal products. And as you were saying in your talk, even the lowest kind of percentile animal products still have more emissions than the highest percentile of plant-based foods. So how do you change, although labeling is good and it will show people kind of what emissions are when they're in the supermarket, how can you change people's kind of perception to plant-based foods to make the change towards that? And is there kind of a time scale of what you would recommend that we should do it in? Because although it's kind of imminent, we should do it. There's been many things in the news recently, like 2050 and all that. But people need to kind of start making a change as soon as possible.
I mean, that's the killer question. How do you encourage widespread behavioural change on anything? The answer is it takes huge amounts of work, huge amounts of time, communication. It's just a massive, massive job. And where we are now, where basically the perception is that meat is healthy in many parts of the world and is something that makes you look affluent. A lot of reports are actually coming out and saying actually meat is carcinogenic and it's unsustainable. And that's a big shift, and reports like the Eat Lancet report are helping to, from a health perspective, to to change the marketing of meat that we've been doing in the West. Particularly, we've been marketing meat in the West for a long time, and milk. for a long time as healthy and aspirational. And some of these reports are saying, actually, it's carcinogenic and it's unsustainable. And that's the beginning of these shifts. And you know, think about how long it's taken to change smoking habits, for example.
Got a question down here.
Hi. I was just wondering about what your thoughts are. You talked a bit about land diversification, different land use. Maybe if we have a smaller footprint by eating plant-based food, then we have more land to do other things. And I'm thinking a bit more about regenerative land use practices and returning land to nature, increasing insect populations and bees and birds, pollinators. And do you, you know, when you talk about the low emissions beer and choosing something like that, if we were to scale that, and there was a comment further up in the crowd about monoculturing, how do we maintain biodiversity levels? Have you got an idea? Are you seeing sort of prescriptive farming, patchworks? Like, what's your thinking around this?
I think biodiversity is one of the things that, you know, maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but I do think it's one of the things that we really don't have a great handle on. You know, it's very, very difficult. You know, we obviously know that natural cropland has sustains lower biodiversity than natural vegetation. What is very difficult to do is provide scalable strategies for driving biodiversity without, for example, organic, which might increase it on the farm, but we use more land and compromise it elsewhere. I think what we need, my personal opinion on what we need to do is we need to actually get farmers monitoring things like birds populations on their own farms. You know, as someone was talking about, you know, below ground life. I think it's just about a step change in what we actually know. And again, I think it's an information thing. I think we're so information scarce on biodiversity that it's just really difficult. Are there any simple practices? My sense would be no. I don't think there are. I think we didn't look at biodiversity specifically in this, but with all these other environmental indicators, you find that there aren't any clear strategies that deliver low impacts. There's so much variability. Sorry, that's not a...
Is there a question here then? Yep.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the talk. I haven't had the chance to read your paper yet, but you're basically using a best case scenario approach in your research method. And I'm hoping for an honest answer from you based on any negative consequences of your best practice scenario where you use no meat and increase the yield of anything else, basically, and also the limitations of your research.
Yeah, that's a fair question. So what we do, we do actually have some sensitivities in the paper and what they're based on. So just to be clear, LCAs, life cycle assessments conducted by researchers, typically all use completely different methodology. And the reason our project took so long is because we've gone into each LCA, collected the original inventory from that, i.e. the original fertilizer use or the different parts, and we've recalculated it all. So the differences in those ranges are not due to methodology, they're actually due primarily to real differences, stuff like geography, practices. But what we did do is in our diet change scenarios, which I think is what you're talking about, we did put a range on them based on what if all new vegetable protein production was the worst case, the 90th percentile vegetable protein. You still find that the results hold. Another way you could do it is say, we did some sensitivities in the end. What, for example, would happen to all when you make oils, you basically get two products. So you get a meal and the oil. What would happen if all that, and that meal today is fed to animals? We looked at, for example, what would happen if that meal didn't have any use. And you can see the sensitivity. So are there limitations of the methodology? Yes, but I think it does come out, our results, while they're a lot higher, do come out pretty consistently with what other people have said, and there are really good reasons why our results have come out higher.
And so from Twitter again, the question about whether impacts, emissions and so on should be measured per gram of protein rather than per gram of food. And is protein the right thing to be measuring against?
Yeah, we had a lot of debate about that one. Everyone's got very strong opinions on what. Because obviously, if you measure meat, or those animal products on like something like B12, you'll get a different answer.
Right.
So what we did was said we basically took food groups that people are actually making decisions between what to have. So we looked at milks, and we looked there are two in the slides. There are some more in the paper. So there's, milk, dairy milk, oat milk, whatever, soy milks, and some other ones. They're actual choices people are going to make. It's a food group, and we express them all for the same amount. We corrected them for protein. Those animal products, the vegetable proteins that we've got in there, are ones that people are actually choosing between. We put grains in there as well, because most people don't know this. 41% of our protein intake is actually from grains globally. So we included grains in there. So we're trying to just say what are the groups that consumers are actually choosing between.
Information we need, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's a question over here.
Charlie Kennel from Christ College and University of California, San Diego. I hope the audience will forgive me, but I'm about to ask you a technical question about your analysis. I was very impressed with the large range of environmental performances that you found in the various commodities and regions, but I was wondering if you looked at the regions and commodities that had the smallest range of environmental variability, did they have anything in common? And can you learn from looking at the subset where the performance is almost the same wherever you go?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think so it depends which. I assume you're talking about crops, but I would actually start with animal products. If you look at pork and poultry and eggs, these are systems that are actually globally incredibly homogeneous. You go to a poultry farm in Indonesia, it's basically exactly the same as one in the United States. It's indoors. For crops, what we're seeing in general is a trend towards homogenization in many regions, in homogenization of practices, larger field sizes. So I think in some areas, some that would come to mind immediately, is, for example, the Cerrado region of Brazil, where soy is cultivated in a very, very similar way. Palm, differences in yield between palm in Indonesia is 2 or 3 ton standard deviation. It's tiny. Palm in Nigeria is something like 8 tons per hectare compared to Nigeria. So you've got there are some crops. Basically, if the crop is new, like palm or soy in Brazil, and if there's a big trend like in America towards a lot standardization for commercial reasons, yeah, you do get much smaller variability, because ultimately farming is about making the environment as predictable as you possibly can. It's about it's about changing the soil to make it as to make it as consistent as possible. That's what farming is. It's about changing the natural environment to make it as easy for us to grow as we can.
Yeah, there's a question over here. Yep.
Thank you. Really great talk. Just a thought. Would you commend putting in the label, including one on the environmental impacts and whether when the food is not eaten, the food waste? Because food waste is a big environmental impact as well, and if that's not a solution you recommend, then are there other solutions you can think of?
Well, that's an interesting question. For instance, if you have orange peel, which goes into the waste, orange peel in the UK is not a natural thing to go into the waste. I mean, or does that not really matter too much?
Well, I think there are two things on food waste. One is like the disposal, and another is the amount of waste that a consumer typically wastes. So, like, some people eat a lot. Like someone I know eats the actual whole apple, like the lot. It just shocks me every time. I'm like, where's that thing gone?
And does that friend of yours also eat the whole banana?
No. So, but I think it's an interesting thing. I think you could look at it from both ways. We didn't look at the disposal of food in our database. We did look at the disposal of packaging, which is quite important, actually. We didn't look at consumer waste. Why? Because it's so variable. In Africa and in many of the less industrialized countries of the world, food waste is consumer food waste is 2 or 3%, whereas food waste in the rest of the supply chain is 20, 30, 40%. In countries like the UK and the US, that flips. So you get 2 or 3 or 5% food waste pre-farm, at the farm and post-farm levels. Consumer waste is 30%. So you've got that interesting relationship, and it's because food is so cheap and easily and readily available, and we live a convenience lifestyle, and it is really important to try and food waste is an incredibly important issue. I didn't think we could add much to the debate in our papers. We didn't.
So we're coming to the end. So I have a couple more questions, and then Joseph's going to be here to speak to everybody for some time.
Yeah.
I do just want to make a small announcement. We've got for the Cambridge Science Festival on the 14th of March. We've got James Lovelock, who's 99 years old this year. He turns 100 this year. He is unable to attend in person because he's in the evenings. He can't come in attend in person. So it's going to be he'll be a video stream with Helen Chesky, Chris Rapley, and Tim Lenton as panelists on the stage, and that will be in as the Cambridge Science Festival. It's a good idea to book online for that because I'm pretty sure they will sell out. So I just thought it's sold out already. Well, not everybody turns up, so it's interesting. There are 200 or so people who signed up on Eventbrite for this, and this room holds 130. That's the way the Eventbrite works. Right, we've got 2 more questions, and then we'll wind up. There's one over there. That's it. Yeah.
I think your point about consumerism is very important because you can change the farms, but the consumers supply the demand. So I was thinking with your thing about the labels as well. And like you were saying before, you get the government involved, get companies involved. So is it possible to kind of work with places like Tesco, who if people buy more environmentally friendly products, they can get Tesco points, and like you were saying, 50% on your surveys were doing it for environmental reasons, maybe a high percent of the people who are not are doing it for price reasons. So no matter why people are buying environmental products, whether it's price or environmental reasons, if you can get people to do it through supermarkets like Tesco and Tesco Club Points, it means that the environmental impact is reduced. And then when Tesco, for example Tesco, if they employ this, they are more likely to get more customers because of that. So then it's kind of a snowball effect of other companies and other supermarkets.
Interesting that you say Tesco, because Tesco just announced a scheme with WWF to reduce the impact of a shopping basket by half, reduce the environmental impact of a shopping basket by half. So that's a pretty big commitment from a retailer that's in fairness is profit driven. So that is a real positive statement that I think is fantastic. And whether Tesco's delivers on that is different because interestingly Tesco's in 2007, 2008 said they were going to put environmental labels on carbon labels on their food, and I think they got to 6 products and they're like. But so did Walmart. Walmart said they were going to label them, they didn't. And the difference between then and now is that the science has radically moved on. The cost of doing these environmental assessments has radically dropped. It's just a different playing field. So I think the fact that Tesco's and hopefully other retailers have made these big commitments and that it's much easier to now deliver on them, I think hopefully these things are going to start coming together, hopefully.
So we've got one last question out the back here.
Hi there. I've got one question about eating out market. So the label system is going to work for, say, retail, but how are we going to pass that message on to hospitality industry in the UK?
Yeah, so I think with what we're saying is we don't need to do all of the mitigation or all of the work through consumers. And there are other examples. For example, commodity crops like soy, it's very hard to trace them through the supply chain. So really mitigation efforts are going to have to focus on using monitoring tools, on incentivizing farmers to change their practices. And that's where that cool field to market is really working. There's some great companies involved in that. I think Kellogg's is asking their producers to measure their impacts through this field to market. And that really matters for commodity crops, because no matter how good a traceability you get, you can't trace these accurately today, and I don't think we'll get there in the future. So on hospitality, I would say, I know some people are putting labels on little red, white, red, amber, green on menus, so you could do that. But it doesn't all have to be through consumers. A lot of the mitigation is going to have to work at the producer level.
So thank you very much, Joseph and Hughand, for a very interesting talk. Thank you for all the questions, and if we could give another round of applause. Thank you to all who joined us tonight. Your presence makes all the difference to our committee effort. Please do join us next week to our talk by Ro Randall, a psychoanalytical trained psychotherapist researching, writing and blogging on climate change, who will be discussing how we can deal with the strong feelings climate change evokes in ourselves and in others. Thank you.